Howdy, it's Kyle talking about Maryland. I'll be discussing Annapolis, Baltimore, and a bunch of other cities, physical geography aspects including the mountains and Chesapeake Bay, economic indicators including industries driving the economy and taxes, as well as cultural aspects. So this is the video for you if you're interested in learning more about the Old Line State. Maryland sits along the Atlantic coast. It's the southernmost of the really small states. At the most recent census, the population was over 6.1 million. That was up from over 5.7 million at 2010. It's 42nd in area. I call it the largest of the micro-states. The next smallest state in the country is West Virginia, which is twice the size of Maryland. It was admitted to the Union in 1788 as the seventh state, and its nickname is the Old Line State, sometimes referred to as the Free State. The capital city is Annapolis with about 41,000 people. It's the 8th least populous state capital in terms of the city size itself, but that's a little misleading because it's located within Anne Arundel County, which has about 580,000 people. It's part of the greater Washington-Baltimore combined metro area, and it's about equidistant between both DC and Baltimore. And besides being the state capital, it's also well known for being home to the U.S. Naval Academy. So you take a small historic city located within a large metro area, a nice downtown, nice waterfront, home to the Naval Academy, and overall Annapolis, pretty nice place. The largest city in the state is Baltimore. At the most recent census, the population was about 585,000, although now it's estimated to be 576,000. With the overall DC-Baltimore combined metro area being over 9 million people, approximately 2.5 to 3 million of those are in the Baltimore side, and about 5.5 to 6 million of those are in the DC side. But with places like Annapolis, but also Frederick and Columbia kind of in between the two, it's hard to say really where one metro ends and the other one begins, but a lot of people there. The downtown is the heart of the city. It's the most historic part and also the most touristed part. This is where you have the Inner Harbor. This is home to the big Harbor Place area, the Pier 6 Pavilion, and the PowerPoint Live. That's one of those Live Nation chain entertainment districts. So that part of downtown has more of a blah type generic feel that many other cities have, but just southeast of that is where it gets a little more interesting. Right next to downtown is the historic neighborhood of Fells Point. Some nice old homes there right along the harbor front, and this is a touristy area, but it's also the main part of town for locals that come out for more of a party type nightlife. Just east of that is the Canton neighborhood. This is more of a yuppie hipster type neighborhood, more cool, laid back, but still a fun nightlife and shopping area. And Canton is one of several neighborhoods in the city that has been gentrified over the past 20 years or so. Just south of downtown on the other side of the harbor is Federal Hill, so if you've seen photos of the downtown skyline from a higher vantage point, it's probably from Federal Hill. And this is another very historic part of town, some good restaurants and retail, and it's a very desirable part of town in which to live. It reminds me of Back Bay in Boston. You go a few miles north of downtown, you get to Charles Village. This is a cool, trendy neighborhood as well. It's very near the campus of Johns Hopkins University, so even when the city was in its darkest days, this area was always kind of nice because you have the anchor of a World League university being right there. However, between this neighborhood, Charles Village, and downtown is an area called Station North, and this has been gentrified recently. Up until about 10-15 years ago, this was a fairly low-income area with some high poverty, but it's been transformed into the Station North Art and Entertainment District. In the south part of the city, you have the Baltimore Peninsula. This is an area that's currently undergoing some massive revitalization, some big-time gentrification. It's hard to get details on this project, even though it's this huge, gigantic waterfront project. It's being developed by the Under Armour CEO. There's all kinds of stuff going on there with retail and shopping, but unfortunately, most of the housing is luxury apartments. All right, Kyle, that all sounds pretty nice. I thought Baltimore was a dump. What about the rest of the city? I think I'm pretty fair when discussing cities that usually get a bad rap, but Baltimore is deserving of a lot of its bad rap. I would say the majority of the western half of the city is pretty rough. It would be classified as either slum or blight or just having a lot of abandoned buildings. This is also where you have the highest crime parts of the city, some of the worst gang violence. Now, not all of West Baltimore is rough, but a large percentage of it is. But it's not just West Baltimore, it's also kind of the east central and northeast part of the city as well. So when you take the combined really rough areas on the west side of the city, but also the east and northeast side of the city, I would say that Baltimore has the largest percentage of its area or footprint that will be considered slum or blight. So if you live there or are very familiar with it, please let me know if you think the city is improving or getting worse and what you think of this new Baltimore Peninsula development. I certainly can't go over every city in the state, but I did want to discuss a handful of them that stand out to me. The first one is Frederick. It has a population of about 79,000 people, and it's the second largest city in the state. It's exurban to both Washington and Baltimore, and as a result, it's been growing a lot since 1980. Has a really nice historic downtown, some great boutique shops and restaurants, nice little waterfront promenade. So you got this creek going through downtown with lots of bridges, fountains, and public art. And even though it has had a lot of suburban growth recently, it's a very old city. It was founded in the mid-18th century. So even though Frederick has been sucked into the larger DC-Baltimore metro area, there is still a little bit of open space between it and the more traditional suburbs, and it isn't, I don't think, completely overgrown yet. Not too far up the road from Frederick is Hagerstown, with about 43,000 people. It's the sixth largest city in the state. And like most other good-sized cities in Maryland, it's very historic, founded in the mid-18th century. But that's about where the similarities end between Frederick and Hagerstown. Hagerstown was much more industrial, much more of a manufacturing base as the main part of its economy. And just like Baltimore, many of those factories shut down and jobs went away. And like many towns that lost so many jobs that went into economic decline, drug use became rampant. And you look at today, and Hagerstown is one of the worst opioid towns in the country, one of the highest OD rates in the U.S. And this town's pretty rough, and it goes to show you just kind of a microcosm of Maryland here. You have Frederick, this really nice, very wealthy city, but 20 minutes up the road, this kind of old industrial, drugged out, very poor town. Continuing west into the panhandle of the state is the city of Cumberland with about 19,000 people. And like most of the other industrial cities in the area, it has lost population in every census since 1950, when the population was twice what it is today. And with this part of the state being right on the West Virginia border, it really does feel like a West Virginia type town. It was home to glass and chemical and tire manufacturers. It does have a nice historic downtown. It looks like a cute little town, and it is the commerce center for the panhandle of Maryland, but also for a lot of the eastern panhandle of West Virginia. But in general, the economic welfare of the panhandle of Maryland is very similar to some of the other Appalachian areas in West Virginia and Kentucky. Okay, going to the north central part of the state is the small town of Emmitsburg with about 3,000 people. It's right on the Pennsylvania border, about 15 minutes south of Gettysburg. A small town, but home to two important things. One is the National Emergency Training Center and the National Fire Academy. And this is kind of like FEMA University, where officials from different cities and counties and states throughout the country come together and learn about good practices in emergency management. And I went up there a few times while working for the state of South Carolina in emergency management, and it's a good way to coordinate with other officials in other states and learn some best practices. But Emmitsburg is also home to Mount St. Mary's University and two important Catholic shrines. One of the shrines is for Our Lady of Lourdes, and the other is for St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, the first American appointed saint. So come to Emmitsburg, where you can either plan for disasters or pray they go away. Going over to the coast, you have the city of Ocean City. Technically, only about 7,000 people live there permanently, but during the summer and during some weekends, there are hundreds of thousands of people that are either living there or staying there. So you look at the population numbers, you might be surprised to see just how big it is, and it actually extends the urban area all the way to the Delaware state line. And unlike most other cities in Maryland, it's not very historic. It was mostly just resorts up until about the past 100 years. It's gone through some big coastal storms, and there was a big beach restoration program in the early 2000s, but it is a big swath of beach. And I do like Ocean City. It isn't as tacky as Myrtle Beach, and it isn't trashy like Atlantic City. But it can also be super crowded, and it's the only true, actual, real beach in Maryland. And the last little town I want to mention is Leonardtown, about 4,500 people in the south part of the state. This is near the point where the Potomac River dumps out into the Chesapeake Bay. And as you can imagine, because of that, it's a very old city. It was founded in the early 1700s, has a really small, cute, historic main street. And perhaps its claim to fame is it's home to the National Oyster Shucking Festival each year. Now I want to get into some of the physical geography of Maryland. Even though it's a small state, because of its very strange shape, it has three distinct physiographic regions. In the west, in the Panhandle, you have the Appalachian Mountains. In the central part of the state, where most of the people live, is the Piedmont. And in the eastern shore, you have the coastal plain. So let's talk about the nature of Maryland. This map does a great job of showing the different parts of the state in terms of its physical geography. I'm going to start by talking about the western portion of the state, the Panhandle, which is mostly Appalachian Mountains. The highest point in the state is Hoy Crest on Backbone Mountain. It stands at 3,360 feet or 1,020 meters. In terms of state high points, Maryland ranks 33rd in the U.S. In the far west of the Panhandle is Garrett State Forest, which is home to Swallow Falls. This is a popular state park and in the winter is often used for cross-country skiing and snowmobiling. Also in the Panhandle is Savage River State Forest. This is the largest contiguous protected area in the state and is home to some of the deepest wilderness and most difficult hiking in the state, as well as some whitewater. This forest is about 77 square miles, so it's a large tract of area within a state that's mostly densely populated. In the eastern portion of the Panhandle, you have Catoctin Mountain Park. Notice how it's carefully Catoctin Mountain Park, not National Park, but it's administered by the National Park Service. And this is a nice park of a natural area, so you can go hiking around and it's protected, but this is also where Camp David is, which is the presidential retreat. So it's a national park, but it's not, but either way, if you go hiking, prepare to be surveilled on trail. One interesting tidbit is that the longest cave in the state is Tanglefoot Cave in the western end near the West Virginia border. Right now it's known to be over 5,000 feet or over 1,500 meters in total passage, but it's still being explored and mapped. And right now, many of the people doing some of the exploring and mapping of the cave think there's a pretty good possibility this might be one of the longest caves in the entire Northeast. So just something else to have varied about the physical geography of the state. Certainly the most prominent river in the state is the Potomac River. The entire western border of Maryland with either West Virginia or Virginia is the Potomac River. And the only portion of western Maryland where the border is not the river is the portion carved out by D.C. One geographic oddity about the border here is that since the border with West Virginia is the natural Potomac River itself, but there's also a line of latitude that government determined to be the border with Maryland and Virginia, the two come very close to each other in the central Panhandle. And in fact, it's only about 2 miles between West Virginia and Pennsylvania by going over this little skinny part of Maryland. So the end result is the Panhandle just barely hanging on to the rest of the state. But perhaps the most prominent physical feature in the state is Chesapeake Bay. And this is the bay that separates the main part of Maryland from the eastern shore. A couple of interesting physical facts about the Chesapeake: it's the largest estuary in the U.S. And what this means is that the water is very brackish, much fresh water coming in from the Susquehanna and other rivers on the west side of the bay, meeting up with the Atlantic Ocean. And this varying salinity has a huge impact on the shellfish and seafood harvested from the bay. So different types of oysters and crabs have different flavor profiles based on the different levels of salinity in the parts of the bay in which they live. And to me, a very surprising fact about the Chesapeake Bay is just how shallow it is. Its average depth is only 21 feet or 6 meters, and there are portions of it where the total depth is under 10 feet or 3 meters. For a huge body of water that is attached to the ocean, this is a very shallow sea. In the central part of the state along the Chesapeake Bay south of Annapolis is Calvert Cliffs State Park. And this is a long line of cliffs that extends for about 24 miles and is pretty well known for being a major area for rock and marine fossil hounding. So kind of like mountains in Maryland not being expected, cliffs along the Chesapeake might not be expected. So going back to this map here, you can see in the Piedmont, in the central part of the state, some terrain, but when you get to the eastern shore and the coastal plain, it's very flat. And even though the eastern shore is very close to Annapolis, it wasn't until 1952 that a bridge was built to actually connect the two. And along the Chesapeake is where you have a lot of wetland areas, including the Jug Bay wetlands not too far from Annapolis. These are freshwater tidal wetlands. It's about 1,600 acres. It's wooded with some meadows. On the mainland of the east shore, you have Pocomoke State Forest, which is a fairly large cypress swamp. And at the south end of the state, along the eastern shore itself, is Tangier Sound. There are many islands in the sound, including some that are wildlife management areas and national wildlife refuges. Some of the islands are uninhabited parkland only. And overall, this part of the state is the center of the shellfish and seafood industry. A lot of oysters and crabs are pulled out of this part of the bay. I talked about how nice the actual beach is at Ocean City, but most of the coastal areas in the state are not beach, but more like a swampy wetland. A popular island offshore in the Atlantic is Assateague Island. This is a 37-mile or 60-kilometer long island, and at its widest spot is only 1 mile across. And this is an area you can visit. You can go on small walks on a boardwalk through a salt marsh. There are some swampy woodland areas with a boardwalk, but the island is probably most well known for its wild horses. So in just a few minutes of discussion, we've gone from Appalachian Mountains to Piedmont to cliffs to swamps to beaches. With a strange shape like Maryland, you can have all this stuff in a small area. In terms of natural disasters, there's really only one major one the state has to worry about. It has been hit with a couple of major hurricanes over the past 40 years. In 1985, Hurricane Gloria was a huge Category 4 hurricane that made different landfalls. One in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. It went back out sea and made another landfall at Long Island, New York. But in between these two landfalls, it heavily impacted Maryland, especially Ocean City and the Eastern Shore. And then in 2012, Hurricane Sandy, which came up the East Coast, did a ton of damage in Ocean City, destroyed the fishing pier. And although the damage in Maryland wasn't as bad as it was in New Jersey, it certainly could have been. So hurricanes are a major concern for the state because there could be a major one make landfall in or very near Ocean City. But with that being said, the state isn't very susceptible to many other natural disasters. You can have flooding basically anywhere, but you don't have huge severe weather. You don't have earthquakes and volcanoes. You don't have major wildfires. So overall, pretty good spot to get away from Mother Nature's natural disasters. Next up, the economics of Maryland. It's generally considered one of the wealthier states with higher incomes and lower poverty and a really strong economy. Its spiritual guru once said, "We're only in it for the money," so let's talk about Maryland and its money. The total GDP of the state is about $488 billion, which ranks it 17th in the US. So with the state being 19th in population and 17th in GDP, Maryland is certainly pulling its weight. Its GDP per capita is about $79,000 per year, which ranks it 17th. But its household income is between $91,000 and $94,000 per year, which ranks it first in the US. There are different ways of calculating household income. The St. Louis Fed actually has Maryland at $108,000 per year, still ranks number one. The poverty rate is either 8 or 9% based on the indicator you use, which makes it one of the 5 lowest in the country, perhaps even the second lowest. Okay, so individuals have a lot of money. How much are they paying in taxes? It has a progressive income tax scale. Overall, it's fairly average. Most people pay around 5%. It has the 13th lowest sales tax in the country, and I can always appreciate that. And it has the 22nd highest property taxes, and the overall property values are above average as well, so property tax bills are above average. So overall, the average tax burden for somebody in Maryland is going to be a little bit higher than the national average. So you overall have a GDP that's pulling its weight, the number one household income in the country, and one of the lowest poverty rates, so the economy of the state is doing pretty well. And the number one reason why the economy is doing so well is its proximity to Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. The largest part of the economy is certainly the federal government and private government contractors. So for example, in Frederick, you have the Frederick National Laboratories for Cancer Research, which is a private laboratory, but it's associated with the National Institute of Health. And also in Frederick, you have Fort Detrick, which is a large Army force, and this is the major center for U.S. biological defense. They changed the words. It used to be for biological weapons. Now it's just biological defense. Much nicer. And also going on at this military installation is a lot of research on infectious diseases. So basically what Fort Detrick is the CDC with military defenses. Imagine the kind of stuff that's going on there if it's the CDC, but they have to have the Army defending it. But Fort Detrick certainly isn't the only large military installation in the state. It's also home to Fort Meade. And this is the head of U.S. Cyber Command and Defense Info Systems. So this is essentially the military's best hackers. Also in the state is the Aberdeen Proving Ground. And this is also a major fort for communications and signal command. Adjacent to the Aberdeen Proving Ground is the defunct Edgewood Arsenal. And whereas Fort Detrick has been home to a lot of the biological weapons and defense research, Edgewood Arsenal was home to much of the chemical weapons research. However, there was so much contamination and so much pollution in this area they had to disband what they were doing there, and probably what they were doing there is now done out in the desert somewhere. And look at these photos. I can just hear them saying in Eric Cartman's voice with all this, "It's fine." Another very important military installation in the state is Joint Base Andrews. This is administered by both the Air Force and the Navy. This is right next to DC, and this is where Air Force One is housed. So certainly much military and very important military stuff going on around here. But because you have so much of that, you also have private government contractors, and Maryland is the corporate headquarters of Lockheed Martin. So because of the government and government contractors, this region is huge for aerospace, telecom, and biotech. And because everything within the federal government can't fit within DC itself, there are many government offices located on the Maryland side. Everything from NASA to NOAA, the FDA, the U.S. Census Bureau, and the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. So proximity to DC has led Maryland to have a very stable economy because you have so many things that you know are going to be there, and you have good paying wages for most of this stuff. But to go along with some of the medical and biotech stuff going on with government installations, the state is also home to Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. And this is one of the premier universities in the country, if not the entire world, for medicine and biotech research. Its medical schools is consistently rated as one of the best ones in the country. Its public health department is usually ranked #1. And overall, the university is elite in many different categories, but it's especially elite in medical and biotech. But you do also have just some good old American corporations headquartered there, including Under Armour, Marriott Hotels, Sinclair Broadcasting, and Geico Insurance. And another major company headquartered there is Purdue Farms, which is a major poultry producer. And Purdue single-handedly makes Maryland either 9th or 10th in the country in terms of overall poultry production. There's a lot of poultry, not just in eastern Maryland, but also in Delaware and eastern Virginia, so much of the Delmarva Peninsula is one giant chicken farm. However, poultry is really the only large aspect of agriculture in the state, and overall the state ranks 36th in ag. But I'll use talking about chicken as a nice segue to talk about some of Maryland's signature foods. When you first think of Maryland food, the first word that's probably going to come to mind is crab. But whether it's just regular steamed, or it's soft shell, or it's made into a crab cake, it's usually going to be blue crab as the species. Although I do have to admit there's something just kind of creepy about soft shell crab. It's the same species as the regular crab, but it's harvested right after it's molted, so there's no hard shell, you can just eat it. But the state is also known for its oysters. Maryland oysters tend to be sweeter and less saline. Again, with the Chesapeake having so much fresh water feeding into it, it's not quite as saline as other parts. So if you don't like really salty oysters, you might like Maryland ones. The state is also known for Old Bay seasoning. It's a spice mix, sometimes used as a rub, usually on seafood, sometimes on poultry. It's very popular in Maryland. They'll dump it on anything, but you'll also see it in the Atlantic and Gulf coasts and the South, where they'll use it almost only with seafood. And if you have a sweet tooth, Maryland's signature dessert is Smith Island cake. And this is a cake with a large number of thin layers alternating between yellow cake and chocolate icing. Sure looks like an awful lot of extra work, but if you insist, I'll take a few pieces. Okay, a couple of quick little tidbits here. The state loves the sport of lacrosse. It's a Canadian sport that's more popular per capita up there, but in the US, it's most popular in Maryland and the Mid-Atlantic region in general. The University of Maryland women's lacrosse team has won 14 national championships. And in men's lacrosse, Johns Hopkins of all schools has won 9 national championships, and the University of Maryland's men's team has won 4. And although lacrosse isn't very popular in the western half of the US or a lot of the Midwest, it is very popular in the Mid-Atlantic, especially Maryland. And the last thing I want to mention is the state flag. Perhaps the most recognizable flag in the country, perhaps the most polarizing flag in the country. They love it. They'll stick it on everything, from their welcome signs, to their license plate, to their sports team logos. I'm reading this straight from the first line of the Wikipedia page. The flag of the state of Maryland is the 17th century heraldic banner of the arms of Cecil, 2nd Baron of Baltimore. So yeah, they love their flag there, so if you visit, be prepared to see it all over the place. So those are the main things I wanted to discuss about Maryland, but I did want to mention a quick little anecdote from when I was back in college. There was a foreign student in the geography department, and I asked her once, if you could visit anywhere in the U.S., where would you like to go? And she was like, I want to go to Maryland. And I was asking her, why would you want to go to Maryland of all the places you could visit? And she was like, it sounds nice. Well, there you go, Maryland. It sounds nice. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up to let me know you approve, and subscribe to this channel if you're interested in learning more about geography from a nerdy perspective. But yeah, thanks for watching. Geography King, signing out. I'd like to give a special thanks to my superior patrons for their support, especially Aaron B. If you're interested in supporting the channel, please check out my Patreon page with the link in the description. And as always, thank you very much.